Our story begins in the sun-scorched lands of North Africa, a region of stunning beauty and stark contrasts. By the late 2nd century BC, this was a region teetering between cooperation and conflict with Rome. Numidia was a Berber kingdom bordering the Roman province of Africa. It was always a kingdom capable of punching on a higher weight class than it should have. After all, Numidian cavalry was fundamental to Hannibal's campaign and to his own defeat at Zama. It was King Massinissa himself, the founder of the Kingdom of Numidia, that delivered that cavalry to Scipio in 202 BC, de facto ending the Second Punic War. By the time our story begins, King Micipsa, Massinissa's grandson, ruled a prosperous kingdom, favored by Rome and completely enclosed in the Republic's political orbit. Micipsa had 3 sons, Hiempsal, Adherbal, and Jugurtha. Jugurtha, of course, was a son only in name, being in truth an illegitimate nephew brought into the royal household. Jugurtha was a striking figure, intelligent, ambitious, and physically gifted. He had the makings of a ruler, but he was third in line. While recognizing Jugurtha's potential, Micipsa recognized also the threat he posed to the stability of the kingdom. For this reason, he decided to send him to Spain to serve under Scipio Aemilianus, the renowned Roman general who finished Carthage in the Third Punic War. The decision to send Jugurtha to serve in the Numantine War, that went from 134 to 133 BC, was ill-advised. Instead of sending away a threat, Micipsa sent Jugurtha into the best training camp he could have asked, turning him not only into a capable commander, but also training him to fight the greater enemy, Rome itself. In Spain, Jugurtha thrived. He earned the admiration of Roman officers for his courage and tactical acumen. Sallust, the Roman historian that's gonna be our main source for the upcoming Jugurthine War, describes him as a man who combined remarkable intelligence with physical endurance, making him a natural leader on the battlefield. More importantly, Jugurtha learned how the Roman system operated, its strength and, crucially, its weaknesses. He saw firsthand how ambition and greed could corrupt even the most disciplined legions, and he took note on how Rome's senator and officials could be swayed by wealth and favors. When Jugurtha returned to Numidia, he was no longer the young prince struggling for recognition. He was a seasoned warrior and a shrewd political thinker, ready to stake his claim to power. Without willing to, Micipsa had created his own monster. King Micipsa died in 118 BC, setting the stage for a civil war. In his will, Micipsa attempted to divide the kingdom equally among his 3 heirs, Hiempsal, Adherbal, and Jugurtha. However, this arrangement was a fragile compromise at best, the dream of a father who didn't want to see bloodshed between his sons. The Numidian elite, after all, was already divided along tribal lines, and quickly coalesced around the rival princess, creating a rivalry that made conflict almost impossible to avoid. According to Sallust, Hiempsal, the youngest and most impetuous of the 3, clashed with Jugurtha first. He insulted Jugurtha, calling him a bastard and denying his rightful claim to power, and was quickly and efficiently assassinated for it. As the seriousness of the situation became clear, Adherbal, the remaining brother, fled to Rome, hoping to leverage the Republic's influence to secure his claim to the throne. This appeal for Roman intervention marked the beginning of a long and bloody entanglement between Rome and Numidia, a situation not too different from the ones the US found themselves recently in Afghanistan or Iraq. Adherbal's plea for assistance reached the Roman Senate and found it full of corruption. Let's try to briefly contextualize the situation. We are not talking about the Rome of Scipio Africanus, of the Punic Wars, of heroic last stand from farmer soldiers. We are talking about a fat Rome. The Roman Republic that just gobbled up half of the Mediterranean Sea and destroyed its most dangerous rival. After defeating Carthage, Rome even had to destroy it when it was far too gone to come back to be a real threat. Why? Because of the glory, because of the wealth, because of the loot. The Roman political system was built on a very specific cycle. You rose up the ranks, you got a consulship, you rule Rome for a year, then you go to a province. You become a proconsul, you rule the province, and you loot it. You take everything the province has, you take it home, and you become powerful again. Use the wealth for new political campaigns or to push your sons into power. With no more great rivals to fight or be afraid of, Rome was turning itself inward, fighting itself, Roman against Roman, senator against senator, as the king of the hill system that made Rome great also made it vulnerable. Jugurtha had first-hand experience with this corruption and was easily able to understand it. Fully aware of the venality of Rome's ruling class, he sent envoys laden with bribes to sway key senators to his side. Instead of waiting for an invasion, he went to Rome with a purse full of gold. Sallust condemns this period as a dark moment in Roman history, noting that Jugurtha's gold had more decisive effect on the Senate than any moral or legal argument. The Senate, unable or unwilling to take a firm stance, brokered a compromise. Numidia was divided into two territories this time, one for Jugurtha and the other for Adherbal. While this arrangement momentarily appeased Rome's senators, it failed to address the underlying power struggle. Jugurtha saw Adherbal as a weak rival, and, in his eyes, this division would not stand. In 112 BC, Jugurtha finally laid siege to Cirta, the capital of Adherbal's territory. The city, a thriving commercial hub, had a significant population of Roman and Italian merchants. When Cirta fell and Adherbal was executed, Jugurtha's forces massacred many of those foreign residents, sending shockwaves through Rome. A mistake, of course, but how can you control a sack, after all? That's what happens when a city falls. The massacre at Cirta sent shockwaves through Rome. Italian merchants, many of whom were Roman citizens or had strong ties to the Roman Republic, demanded retribution. The Senate was left with no choice finally but to declare war on Jugurtha. However, Rome's political landscape was anything but united. This was, after all, just a blip on their radar, and corruption still plagued the Senate. From the words of Sallust, we have a Jugurtha's quote: "Everything in Rome is for sale." He sent emissaries to bribe key senators again, ensuring that the Republic's response to his provocation would remain slow and disorganized. Despite public outrage, the response was delayed and half-hearted. But still, the response was coming, and Jugurtha needed to prepare. Luckily for him, he had all the weapons he needed. Combining Numidia's rugged terrain and the mobile forces his people was known for, he was ready for a guerrilla war like Rome have never seen before. By 111 BC, Rome had appointed Lucius Calpurnius Bestia, consul and experienced general, to lead the Numidian campaign. After having gathered a modest force in Sicily, he crossed into North Africa, landing near the key Roman settlement of Utica. Bestia was cautious, and his initial campaign was slow to start. Instead of immediately marching deep into Numidian territory, he secured supply lines, and attempted multiple scouting missions trying to understand the true strength and the position of Jugurtha's forces. Jugurtha, on his side, had no intention of directly fighting Bestia. As the Romans slowly advanced, he retreated deeper and deeper into Numidian territory, disappearing like a ghost in the rugged terrain. Not finding anything to fight, Bestia advanced towards key cities of Numidia. He moved cautiously along the coastal plain toward Hippo Regius, modern-day Annaba in Algeria, a critical stronghold that could become the key for Rome's future logistical plans in the area. However, the combination of heat and the scarcity of water sources slowed down the progress to a crawl. Like a wolf noticing the opening to his target's neck, Jugurtha acted. He unleashed his cavalry in small bands, harassing the Roman supply lines, ambushing scouting parties, and disrupting Bestia's communication. Jugurtha wanted to frustrate Rome. He wouldn't be able to force them into a retreat, but he managed something even more important when you fight Romans. He made the war frustrating and boring. Discontent was growing between the soldiers, and some of it was even summoned up by Jugurtha himself, sending spies and other agents with rumors and stories about what was in store for them. With the campaign completely stagnated, Jugurtha shifted his focus. Now that the war was boring and the rewards were little, it was time to talk. Under the cover of peace talks with Bestia, Jugurtha managed to open a direct line of communication through which darker, more nefarious dealings could be completed. Bestia and his high officer corps were covered in gifts by the envoys sent by Jugurtha. They were given promises of future compliance, and finally they agreed to a treaty that would allow Jugurtha to remain on his throne. In exchange, Jugurtha promised to pay a nominal tribute to Rome and surrender a token number of war elephants. For Jugurtha, this treaty was a resounding victory. But in Rome, it was a PR disaster, so terrible that the people called for vengeance and blood. In order to handle this vengeful reaction, the Roman political class called for an investigation over these treaties, and Jugurtha was summoned to Rome to act as a witness. A couple of bribes later, the entire investigation was made null and void by the vetoes of 2 tribunes. Everything seemed to have gone Jugurtha's way. He was on the throne, triumphant, and had managed to go to Rome, play their political game, and win. He was proud of himself, but you know how it's said, pride comes before the fall. As the Roman citizenship reacted to the cancellation of the whole investigation, chaos ensued into the city. And right there in Rome was Jugurtha's cousin, Massiva. He saw in the chaos the possibility of a change in ruling in Numidia, the chance to become himself king, just because, well, Jugurtha wasn't really loved by Rome, and Numidia was still in Rome's orbit. Not wanting to deal with an upstart, another rival from his own dynasty, Jugurtha decided to have him killed. To him, the action must have felt natural, just what you do in a situation such as this one, but while much of his success was based around his understanding of Roman ethos and procedure, he didn't understand Rome in this instance. The idea that someone under the protection of Rome could be killed in the streets by a foreign king who was being protected under the same safe conduct rules was unacceptable to the Roman Senate. With one mistake, Jugurtha had turned the Senate from a corrupted political blob into a unified force, calling for vengeance. There would be no peace, and Rome's armies would return to Numidia. Jugurtha's arrogant mistake costed him his peace, and yet he was prepared for war. He wasted no time consolidating his position in Numidia, using a respite provided by the treaty to strengthen his alliance with local tribes, fortify key cities, and rebuild his army. Jugurtha also ensured that his network of spies and informants in Rome remained active, feeding him valuable intelligence about Roman politics and military planning. Moreover, Jugurtha continued to present himself as a legitimate ruler, sending envoys to neighboring kingdoms and emphasizing his peaceful intention to them. This dual strategy of military preparation and diplomatic outreach allowed him to maintain the upper hand even as Rome began to prepare for their renewed campaign. By 109 BC, the Roman Senate, embarrassed by the failures of prior campaigns and eager to restore its credibility, appointed Quintus Caecilius Metellus to lead the war effort in Numidia. Known as a staunch conservative with a reputation for integrity and discipline, Metellus was the ideal candidate to rejuvenate Rome's Flandrian campaign, and being a conservative, he was also a political assurance to the Senate against the rise in power and influence of the Populares faction, who was using the bribery accusations and the corruption as a weapon to push their own political agenda. Metellus' first act upon arriving in Africa with his own troops was to address the inefficiencies and corruption that plagued the Roman legions. The troops stationed in Numidia were demoralized and poorly trained after years of mismanagement. Metellus immediately instilled strict discipline, revoking privileges that had been abused by officers and ensuring soldiers adhered to rigorous training regimens. He reorganized the chain of command, replacing incompetent officers with reliable subordinates, and restructured the army into a more cohesive and adaptable force. Metellus was a meticulous man. He took the time to ensure his supply lines were well defended, strengthened against the attacks of Jugurtha's light cavalry. Journey by journey, day by day, he made the raids more and more dangerous for the Numidians, allowing himself the flexibility needed to finally advance against the main enemy force. Metellus' strategy was clear: neutralize Jugurtha's strongholds, destroy his supply lines, and finally force him into a climactic confrontation. In this he found early success, conquering the city of Vaga, modern-day Beja, and one of the main logistical hubs for Jugurtha's army. From Vaga, Metellus marched south, targeting key Numidian cities and fortifications. Instead of chasing Jugurtha's forces in the desert, he kept to the fertile regions, knowing that as long as he kept hitting Jugurtha in his wallet, be it full of gold or grain, he would have eventually forced him to come out to play. The siege and capture of Tala, modern-day Kasserine in Tunisia, is one of the most notable achievements of Metellus. Tala was a well-defended inland city, a difficult target that forced the Romans to maintain long supply lines for food and especially for water. Jugurtha was bloodied. Losses were piling up, but he wasn't defeated. Finally, he found the moment to strike. As the Roman forces were traversing the narrow pass near the Mutul River, Jugurtha's forces, hidden in the hills overlooking the pass, launched a sudden attack on the column. While the Romans in the end managed to avoid being destroyed by the sudden ambush with sheer discipline, they suffered heavy losses and didn't manage to capture Jugurtha, their main objective that could have ended the war on the spot. With Metellus' supply lines outstretched and the Romans deep into Numidia, Jugurtha's next move reminds us of modern wars. He employed scorched earth tactics, destroying crops, poisoning wells, and evacuating towns before their enemies arrived. With resources denied to him, Metellus was forced back in the role of administrator and organizer. He was again in a situation where controlling his supply lines was more important than controlling the war. Everything slowed down to a crawl again, turning the war into pure attrition. This second phase of the war was a phase created by pure anger. Rome was avenging a blemish on its honor. But anger doesn't last forever. While he was fighting in the field, Jugurtha was also fighting politically in Rome. He still had his spies, his influence and his wealth, and the people of Rome were asking for a swift end to the conflict. We have said at the beginning how this war is similar to the forever wars we are used to right now. Try to imagine maintaining army after army on the field for year after year. People that now cannot work their crops, cannot see their wives or help with their flocks. Entire lives were being destroyed without the use of a sword or an arrow. People wanted to go home. And by 108 BC, they were ready to look to someone else to lead the war effort. Enter stage a man we have already talked about in other videos, Marius. Born in Arpinium, a small town southeast of Rome, in 157 BC, from a wealthy and influential family, but without the ancient blood ties that characterized the great families of Rome. A novus homo, a new man. Marius' talent as a soldier was recognized by great men of the Republic, such as Scipio Aemilianus, destroyer of Carthage we've already cited, and possibly one of the most influential Roman politicians at the time. And having secured the positions of Tribune of the Plebs and Praetor, he was poised to make a move for the consulship. During Metellus' campaign in Numidia, Marius served as a legatus, a deputy, in Metellus' army itself. He believed that the war could be won faster, and that the methodical approach of his commander was costing Rome too much. When talking about the possibility of higher office with Metellus, Marius was frustrated to find himself mocked by his superior. Metellus, after all, suggested that Marius could run when his son, Metellus' son, was old enough to run for office. Being that Metellus' son was yet a young boy, it is clear that the proposal was meant to offend. Resolved to take action and advance, Marius returned to Rome to secure the consulship. Marius' campaign for consul in 107 BC was unprecedented. Traditionally, candidates for high office relied on noble ancestry and the support of the Senate aristocratic elite. Marius, lacking these advantages, appealed directly to the plebeian class. He portrayed himself as a self-made man, a military hero, and a champion of the common people against the corrupt aristocracy, the corruption that had turned the Jugurthinian War into a long, unending slaughter. Marius skillfully leveraged the failures of the Jugurthinian War to his advantage. He criticized the Senate handling of the conflict, accusing it of corruption and incompetence. His rhetoric resonated with the Roman people, who were disillusioned with the Senate's inability to bring Jugurtha to justice. With his populist platform combined with a reputation as a capable commander, he won overwhelming support, and in a decisive victory was elected consul for the year 107 BC. Becoming the first novus homo in decades to achieve the Republic's highest office. As one of his first acts as consul, Marius secured command of the war, directly undermining Metellus by using a plebiscite to take him out of the war. This was a sharp break in Roman custom, since usually the Senate controlled military appointments, and cemented Marius as a populist leader, opposed to the optimates of the right wing. We have already talked about the Marian reforms in our third episode of the Eternal City, so just to provide a quick context here, when Marius departed for Numidia, he did it with a new kind of army, a reformed army. He brought the Capitecensi into the recruitable pool. The Capitecensi were the people who owned nothing, meaning that for the first time in Rome, Those who are landless, who owned nothing, could be recruited in the army. These people were willing and even enthusiastic to take arms and go for adventures, trying to make something of themselves and maybe, just maybe, have something for them waiting at the end of the campaign. Now an important politician, Marius also made alliances with the ancient families of Rome. To this end, he married Julia, a member of the powerful Julii family and aunt of Julius Caesar. With this union, he became a man who symbolized the blending of old aristocratic prestige with new populist powers. By the time Marius landed in Numidia in 107 BC, Jugurtha's options were dwindling. In Rome, Metellus was hated for the long time he was taking winning this campaign, but in Numidia, he had deprived Jugurtha of many strongholds and allies, forcing him into an increasingly defensive posture. Jugurtha's survival depended on exploiting Numidia's harsh terrain and maintaining the loyalty of his remaining forces. Now, after this onslaught, he found himself to face a new general, bolder, more aggressive, and leading an army that was far harder to corrupt and manipulate. Ironically, while Marius tried to force Jugurtha into a direct confrontation, he ended up in the same exact situation Metellus was in. He started building forts, digging roads, building a logistical network in Numidia that, like a spider web, was slowly trapping Jugurtha, enveloped more and more in the rugged terrain he used for defense, finding that every week a new hiding spot had disappeared. As Marius advanced deeper into Numidia, Jugurtha finally sought to exploit local tribal alliances. He called upon his father-in-law, Bocchus, the king of Mauretania, for support. Bocchus' involvement introduced a new dynamic to the conflict, as his kingdom bordered Numidia to the west. While initially hesitant to fully commit, Bocchus provided troops and shelter to Jugurtha, complicating Marius' campaign. As the noose tightened around Jugurtha, Marius found the moment to strike a definitive blow. With an unexpected show of discipline and logistical skill, Marius moved his legions through the desert, reaching Capsa, an important stronghold and logistical hub for Jugurtha. Caught off guard and unprepared, Capsa fell to the Romans, sending Jugurtha in a spiral of desperation. With few options left, the King of Numidia ran to Bocchus of Mauretania, asking for help, as we said, but also refuge and respite. Bocchus himself, though, was capable of seeing how things were going, and while the alliance was advantageous to him in the short run, he knew that in the end he was gonna find himself in the orbit of Rome, no matter what. In order to save himself, his people, and mainly to gain something from all of this, Bocchus entered secret negotiations with Rome. Here we find another great character of the Eternal City story, Lucius Cornelius Sylla, the ambitious questor working under Marius. Sylla, eager to distinguish himself, was instrumental in the negotiations with Bocchus. He traveled to Mauretania personally, meeting with the king and putting the final nail of persuasion to betray Jugurtha in exchange for favorable terms from Rome. Unaware of the betrayal, Jugurtha was finally lured into a trap and captured. He was handed over to Sylla, marking the end of Jugurtha's resistance and the conclusion of the war. Once proud and capable of playing Rome's politics better than many senators, Jugurtha was brought to Rome in chains. He was paraded in Marius' triumph in 104 BC, turning from a threat to a symbol of Rome's power and inevitability. The man died short after, and is often forgotten in the list of Rome's great enemies. And yet, so many innovations that made Rome into what we know today, and into an empire, were created to confront this man, to fight his ability to use Rome's republican system against itself. The man who assumed power through assassination was then undone by one more assassination. Just one more knife into the darkness that provoked an entire people into ending him for good. I hope you enjoyed this addendum to our Eternal City series, and if you did, like, comment, and subscribe. See you soon.